So kind of so far in the semester, we kind of started out talking about our basic evolutionary concepts, right? Our forces of evolution, how things like gene flow, natural selection, how all those mechanisms work in populations, right? And then we moved on to kind of narrowing our focus to the um, primate end of the spectrum there and showing, what makes primates distinct from the rest of the animal kingdom, as well as what kind of led up to the development of hominins, as at the end of the Miocene period, with the development of kind of bipedality. And now we'll kind of look at the next two lectures kind of jump back and forth in time. We're going to talk about two kind of groups. We're going to talk about Neanderthals a little bit, and we're also going to talk about Homo sapiens, right? And we talk about Homo sapiens in two kind of distinct forms. We talk about archaic versions, which have a little bit more of a robust features, and then we talk about kind of the modern form, which is, the Homo sapiens that we should be familiar with because that's who we are. So to kind of recap in terms of a timeline here, remember this kind of archaic period that we're going to be talking about here covers roughly the kind of last 1 million years, right? And remember that Homo erectus at around 2 million years ago leaves Africa and slowly travels all over the world, right? And by about 350,000 years ago, the first archaic Homo sapiens begin to appear. So during this kind of, the archaic period covers the last million years, but really the kind of later archaic period is the last, the period between 100,000 to 25,000 years ago. And at this point, Homo sapiens appear, modern Homo sapiens at various times in Europe, Asia, and Africa, kind of during this early archaic period. But by the late archaic period, modern Homo sapiens begin to appear in kind of hybridized events here. We start to see modern Homo sapiens that have a mix of both Neanderthal and Homo sapien features. We see Homo sapiens that have a mix of archaic and modern Homo sapien features, which, your archaic features are kind of more similar to what you would see in an earlier Homo erectus form. So this is just showing you kind of Homo sapien middle Paleolithic sites. Every red dot there represents a site. So you can kind of see that by this time, we've kind of moved out to pretty large sections of the world. And more importantly, if you kind of notice, a lot of those areas or a lot of those sites are clustered around river systems as well as coastlines. So essentially what we're doing here is we're following the coastlines or the water systems and using those as kind of a means by which to travel. One of these areas that we see a lot of kind of these interaction sites is this place in these sites in Israel called Amud, as well as Qasde, and School, as well as Tabun, which are all kind of in relative close proximity to each other. And these are one of the sites where we see a lot of hybridization events. We see individuals that have both archaic and modern features, as well as individuals that have Neanderthal and Homo sapien features as well. So in terms of that interaction area in Eurasia, there in the Middle East, by 200,000 years ago, Neanderthals begin to appear in Eurasia. We have fossils from Tabun, Israel, that date to around 170,000 years ago. We have later fossils from Amud that are around 45,000 years ago. And Neanderthals are the first kind of cousin to Homo sapiens, or, depending on what your flavor of taxonomy is, some consider them cold-adapted Homo sapiens. And we'll talk about that later. But in essence, they're kind of the first individuals to display real definitive culture, right? And interestingly enough, Neanderthals actually never made it into Asia proper, right? They basically stuck in kind of the northern Middle Eastern area as well as Europe. So if we look at some of the kind of definitive features that we see in these Neanderthals in terms of their skull morphology, of course you have the big supraorbital torus, the large brow ridge. You have very large nasal cavities, a kind of projecting midface, a little bit of facial prognathism. A big dead giveaway is the large gap behind the third molar before you see the start of the mandible, which you do not see in Homo sapiens. You have the occipital bun as well, which is a protrusion on the occipital bone in the back of the skull. And one of the other big differences you're going to see is that Neanderthals, the forehead kind of slopes back a little more. It's not as tall as you see in modern Homo sapiens. If we look at another hybridization site, we have Riparo di Mezzena, which comes actually from Italy. It's a Neanderthal human hybrid that's been found, and it dates to around 35,000 BP, and it has a mix of cranial features, right, half robust and half gracile. So that's essentially what we see when we see these hybridization events between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. The result of it are kind of specimens that have a mix of features, right? Some of them have a little bit more of an exaggerated brow ridge, but they'll have a taller forehead. Some of them will have an occipital bun, but they won't have a brow ridge, right? So you get a mix of kind of these robust and gracile features. So this is showing you the typical kind of Neanderthal skull here, and you note right away the kind of big brow ridge there, as well as the gap behind the third molar, as well as the kind of sloping forehead, right? It's not as tall as we would see in Homo sapiens. So these, all of the kind of red dots here outlined are all major sites where we have found Neanderthal specimens, right? And kind of the shaded area there kind of shows that's about as far as that's the Neanderthals, essentially their home range, right? So they never really made it much further south in Iraq. They never really made it into China or other places in Asia, and they were not in Africa. So one specimen that we have is the Tabun Woman from the Tabun site in Israel. She's a female fossilized Neanderthalensis. And what's interesting about her is that if you compare her to kind of some of the late archaic Homo sapien specimens that we find in kind of Western Europe, her morphology is actually very similar, right? But she's still kind of classified as a Neanderthalensis because she's found in the same layer in association with a lot of exclusively Neanderthal items, tools, and other burials. So this is showing you the Tabun site, and it's kind of an interesting site in the fact that what we're looking at here is a huge amount of occupation layers here. You can kind of see how they've dug them out in terms of kind of keeping with the layers, and they also have kind of sublayers that are labeled as well. This essentially was the original floor of the cave, right? And kind of all the rest of this has kind of been excavated away in order to kind of find all of the kind of fossil evidence that was in the cave system. So this is showing you one of the burials that were found, right? So in essence, this is generally how we find kind of these archaic burials and these Neanderthal burials. And one difference that we do see during this time is kind of early archaic Homo sapiens aren't really burying their dead. But when we get to Neanderthals, we do see purposeful burials. So if we look at some features of the Amud Neanderthal, which dates to around 45,000 BP, this is another site in the Middle East. They have small eye orbits, much similar to that of a Homo sapien, but a very large nasal aperture, which is similar to a Neanderthal. No occipital bun, which is more Homo sapien. Small dentition, Homo sapien. Protruding chin, Homo sapien. Large brow ridge, more of a Neanderthal feature, right? And this is comes from Amud, Israel. So what we're seeing here, of course, is another hybridization event, right? So we're seeing a mix of features between Homo sapien and Neanderthal. So we'll talk a little bit about this place called Shanidar, which is otherwise known or more commonly known as the Clan Cave. Unfortunately, they don't have any really good maps of it, so you can kind of get it's just kind of south and east of Turkey in a general sense, and it's kind of marked by that little red dot that you see down in there. So the Shanidar Cave Neanderthals, or the Clan Cave, it's located in northern Iraq and dates to around 45,000 years ago. There are 7 adults and 3 children that were uncovered, or 3 juveniles. They have very interesting pathology, right? And we'll take a look at that here in a second. They had typical Neanderthal features. There was an occipital bun on the skulls, larger brow ridges, as well as larger nasal apertures, or larger, lovingly referred to them as nose holes, right? So this is showing you Shanidar Cave, and as you can see, it's a fairly sizable cave, and it offers kind of a few different things, right? Much like kind of Zhaocaodian cave systems in China, you know, a lot of these groups were choosing these caves for not only their kind of ability to get you out of the, you know, elements of the weather, but also for their ability for defense and protection, right? Because no one can approach that cave without the occupants of the cave knowing that those people are approaching, right? So it offers them kind of a little bit of security as well. So why are, you know, when we look at kind of ancient human studies, there's a lot of focus that's placed on Neanderthals, right? And there's kind of a reason for that, right? Neanderthals are kind of the last intermediate form that we see in terms temporally before we have fully modern Homo sapiens, right? So Neanderthals and modern Homo sapiens existed at the same time and interbred with one another. A lot of us on the planet have a certain percentage of Neanderthal DNA within our genome. So if we look at the Shanidar cave burial number 1, something is very interesting that occurs with this particular individual. It has a typical kind of Neanderthal features with a large brow ridge and a very large nasal aperture. But it has anterior tooth wear, which indicates that the front teeth were being used as tools. You can kind of see how dramatically these front teeth have kind of been worn down there. There's atrophy to the right humerus, and the left humerus is shown there for comparison, right? So there was an injury, and we know based on kind of the cut marks, and I'll show you a picture here in a second, that this is the lower arm was amputated, right? So this shows not just that these individuals were able to kind of survive in the landscape, but also that they had some form of medical knowledge, right? Because they would have needed to have been able to amputate that and stop the bleeding. And, you know, it's because this individual didn't die from this injury. They lived for quite some time afterwards. So this is showing you some of the other wear patterns that we see. This is actually fairly common. This kind of crescent moon shape that occurs in the tooth, and what you're doing there is that's because you're anchoring thread, or the knot of when you're making thread, in that tooth, right? And as you're spinning that thread, it kind of wears that tooth down over time. Or you're using your teeth to sharpen bone tools, right? And that will also wear your teeth down over time. So this is showing you that humerus from the Shanidar cave burial number 1, right, the one that where the lower arm was amputated. And you can see that humerus is atrophied quite a bit, right? The bone is very skinny. It's actually a little malformed. So that really indicates that this individual actually survived the amputation, lived for quite some time, probably dealt with a couple of infections, but in the end was actually able to survive the kind of impromptu surgery. So in essence, you know, what does this humerus really tell us? Well, we know the right arm was likely atrophied and amputated at the elbow. Chronic infection could have occurred due to lack of normal cortical bone thickness, right, the kind of thinness of that bone. And there could have been a nutritional deficiency, right, because he may have been having difficulty getting food for himself because of his injury. So if we look at some of the Neanderthal finds in Europe, right, so kind of shifting away from the Middle East and moving over to Europe, we have the Krapina site in Croatia, which has specimens that date to around 130,000 years ago. The fossil record in Croatia ends abruptly at 32,000 BP. So it's not in essence that people kind of left. It's just, you know, fossilization may have not been conducive at that point, right? So the Krapina site is not a cave. It is a rock shelter, right? So when you kind of read the literature, that you might hear some refer to it as a cave. It's actually not a cave, right? Because it doesn't have kind of the caverns and chambers that a normal cave has, right? It's more of a rock shelter, right? Which is just kind of an outcropping of rock that they use as kind of a temporary residence. So this is just showing you some of these specimens that have been pulled out of Krapina. So quite a few, and this is on average, what we find. We get these kind of, we might get some large chunks, but generally you're finding these tiny little pieces, and you need to spend quite a bit of time reconstructing all of these skeletons to kind of get an idea of what you're really looking at. So if we look at the cranial features of the Krapina population, they had very large rounded orbits. They had larger spaces between their eyes, so less facial neoteny. They had a wider nasal aperture, so larger nose holes, and they had a pronounced brow ridge with a protruding face, right? So a little bit of facial prognathism. We may also have evidence of either cannibalism or some form of ritual burial practice that we see at Krapina. We have a few human long bones that have cut marks on them, and we're just not really 100% sure if they were eating each other or if they were removing the flesh from the skeletons as part of some sort of burial rite. We're just not sure. But something that kind of supports the notion of cannibalism, right? We know that it's not uncommon among Neanderthal groups, right? Whenever resources become scarce, we tend to see cannibalism occur, right? And that's just not Neanderthals, that's also in human groups as well. We have sites in southern France, like the Moulin-Gercy cave site, where we've seen evidence of cannibalism. The El Cedrone pit in Spain, we've seen evidence, and most cut marks are due to marrow extraction. So essentially what they're doing is trying to crack the bones open to get at the bone marrow. And right in the kind of picture here, you can see kind of a fanciful rendition of Neanderthals from 1909, because when they were originally found, they weren't even thought to be human, right? They were thought to either be some entirely separate species, or that they were thought to be kind of a diseased form of humans. So we also have a site called La Chapelle-aux in France, and this site dates to kind of very late, dating to after 45,000 BP. And remember, modern Homo sapiens evolved in Africa around 180,000 years ago, right? So there's significant overlap between these kind of Neanderthals that are running around at the same time as both archaic and modern Homo sapiens are running around, right? So these kind of La Chapelle-aux Neanderthals are used, one of the kind that are used as a type specimen for Neanderthals. The cranial features, of course, include an elongated skull, a low forehead, right, a large and wide nasal aperture, brow ridge, and, of course, a reduced chin. So this is showing you one of our specimens from La Chapelle-aux. And the interesting part about this particular specimen is that it's edontless, right? It's lost a lot of the teeth there, right? And not lost them, and died shortly afterwards because he didn't have any teeth. No, you can see that the bone itself is remodeled, right? So that means, since you don't see any tooth sockets anymore, that means that he lived long enough and probably had help eating his food, or at least, was subsisting off of kind of mashed food, which allowed him to kind of survive for long after he lost those teeth. So in terms of Neanderthal life overall, some of the information that we have gleaned about their kind of average or daily life is that their lifespan was pretty short. At average age at death was around 30 to 35. Lots of violence. Most of our Neanderthal skeletons show some evidence of interpersonal violence. Lots of migration and lots of interbreeding with modern Homo sapiens. On average, Neanderthals, because of kind of the different orientation of their skull features, it's kind of difficult to see, but on average, their babies did have larger brains than Homo sapiens did, which probably caused a bit of a problem, right? When we look at, something we call in kind of modern medicine, the obstetric dilemma, right? When you're trying to birth a large headed child through a very small birth canal, in essence, you can run into complications, right? So we have a lot of instances of Neanderthal babies dying and mothers dying in birth because the baby's head wasn't able to fit through the birth canals. So if we look at some fun facts for our Neanderthals, just a little more details about their daily life. The kind of first ones popped up around 450,000 years ago, so a little bit before kind of archaic Homo sapiens, and they existed all the way up to about 40,000 years ago, right? And some are a little bit later. And they're found all over Europe and a little bit in the Middle East. They made clothing. They had controlled use of fire. They were capable of symbolic thought as well as producing art, and the first specimens for our Neanderthals were found at Fellhofer Cave in the Neander Valley in Germany in the mid-19th century, right? So they were actually found right around the time where Darwin came out with his kind of theory of natural evolution via natural selection. Some other important Neanderthal finds that we see, of course, we have the Neander Valley finds around 40,000 years ago, the Elsadrone around 49,000, the Vindija specimens from 38,000, and the, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, from around 60 to 70,000. And of course, we have actually, now we have kind of all sorts of specimens that exist kind of in the Middle Eastern region here. We've got specimens that we found in this region here. So in essence, we have, more finds that aren't listed on this map here. So we've already kind of talked about this a little bit towards the beginning of the lecture here, but the primary differences I want you guys to know in terms of differences between Neanderthal skulls and modern Homo sapiens is the protrusion of the occipital bun back here, the kind of lower forehead with sloping brain case, the very large brow ridge, the gap behind the third molar, and that's pretty much it, right? And the kind of larger nasal cavity, but you're going to see a lot of variation in terms of the nasal cavity here. So some humans are going to have larger than normal nasal cavities, right? So during this lecture, we're going to talk about something called the kind of cold adapted sapien hypothesis, that Neanderthals, because they are so genetically similar to us, that they really shouldn't be considered a separate species. They really should just, their kind of unique morphology and their kind of unique kind of migratory patterns really should be viewed as the result of kind of adapting to this cold environment, right? Rather than this kind of Pleistocene or Ice Age environment, rather than, really being a distinct and separate species. There are others out in the field of physical anthropology that will argue that they are, in fact, a separate species. We're going to look at both of the issues, and, I'll let you guys decide which side that you fall on. But in general, what we see in terms of skeletal differences, in terms of the postcrania, the chest cavity for the Neanderthals tends to be a little wider. They tend to be overall a little bit shorter and stockier in terms of their skeletal features rather than modern Homo sapiens, which are a little bit taller and thinner. So we're looking at really, going back to adaptive physiology here, right? That it looks at how the environment can change the body proportions or facial features of an individual, right? Remember Bergman's and Allen's rule. So also remember kind of how low oxygen adaptations alter the body, right? So the human face is highly susceptible to change in the environment, right? And more importantly, the human sinus passages. We've talked in our lectures about, back when we were in class, we talked about kind of modern human variation and how important or how important the nasal cavity was for proper lung function. So if we look at the Neanderthal body plan, they had enormous nasal apertures or nose holes, which was a clear thought to be an adaptation to cold environments. The larger noses are better at moistening the air and warming the air before it hits the lungs. Right, and remember, cold air is, really bad for your lungs. So larger nasal apertures are not unique to Neanderthals, though. We see them in humans as well. So if we look at the differences in vascularization between modern Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, in general, the foramina, or kind of the holes in the bone in which the innervation goes through and the vascular system goes through to feed blood to the bone, they're much larger in Neanderthals than they are in modern humans. The infraorbital foramina, the ones that go to the face in Neanderthals, are huge, which if you think about it makes sense if we go with this kind of cold adapted sapien hypothesis, right? It would be better to have that better circulation in order to kind of fend off the cold, right? So these foramina are responsible for kind of transporting blood to the face. So here we can see a couple things on our little Neanderthal skeleton here, right? The gigantic nasal aperture, the very large infraorbital foramina, as well as you can see up here evidence of violence, right? You can actually see two pieces of violence, right? This is these are blunt force trauma wounds. So Neanderthals, in terms of their body size, they were much smaller than modern humans are. Their limbs were shorter than earlier or later humans. Having a reduced trunks and, of course, limbs leaves less surface area to heat, right? Remember Bergman and Allen's rule, right? So it is not the height that matters, but the width of the body in terms of our response to cold. So here we can see some of the differences that we see in the nasal cavities or passages of the, modern Homo sapien on the right versus a Neanderthal on the left here. And you can see that they're kind of in terms of the sinus passages, they're kind of in the general same area, right? But there's some interesting studies that have kind of looked at these differences in the nasal passages. So in essence, having a larger nose on the exterior does not necessarily mean larger nasal cavities, as is stated in your book, right? A study from SUNY in New York from 2014 showed that modern human nasal cavities are actually very different than that of Neanderthals. So from the study itself, they say that the study joins a growing body of evidence that the upper respiratory tracts of this extinct group function via a different set of rules as a result of a separate evolutionary history and overall cranial bow plan, resulting in mosaic features not found among any population of Homo sapiens, right? So the SUNY study really kind of supports the notion that Neanderthals are in fact a separate species, but they are so closely related to us in our genus that we are capable of interbreeding with them. So more evidence that kind of pushes the notion that Neanderthals are just a very, very highly closely related species in our genus and not the same as Homo sapiens. We know that they contributed roughly 20% of their genome to the modern human gene pool, and everyone has Neanderthal DNA except for Africans, right? We all have about 2% of Neanderthal DNA in us, except for Africans, right? So you can't really say that we would be part of the same species, otherwise we would find that in Africans as well, right? This could also be due to something that we refer to as a DNA desert on one of the sex chromosomes, but we'll talk about that here in a second. So if we look at a study from Harvard in 2014 on DNA deserts, from the article itself, they may provide a roadmap to positions in the genome that endow uniquely human traits, right? Where they are absent, natural selection may have decided that the anatomically modern human versions were doing a better job and so eliminated the Neanderthal counterparts. Hence, these deserts or these kind of absences may help us define the most important genetic differences between us and them. So kind of an interesting, from that study or subsequent study coming from the same researchers, they found a DNA desert on the X chromosome in Neanderthal DNA, right? So there are kind of these DNA deserts on the X chromosome that control testes development in males. So this suggests that the male hybrids between lineages of Neanderthals may not have been fertile, whereas the females might have been fully fertile. So what this is really suggesting is that, okay, humans and Neanderthals came into contact with one another, they began to interbreed, but any of the male hybrids from those breedings would not have been able to breed, right? So slowly over time, as the climate's changing, as the Pleistocene is ending, as the Ice Age is ending, Neanderthals are becoming fast unfit for the environment. So as they're kind of breeding with these Homo sapiens who are becoming more populous, those hybrid males are unable to continue that, Neanderthal line, right? So essentially what we're seeing is an aha moment here, right? We're starting to see the dwindling of Neanderthal DNA over time, right? That's why they've only really contributed 20%. So if we look at Neanderthal life in terms of their food subsistence or acquisition, they were hunters. They were very prolific hunters. There are tons of animal bones found at Neanderthal sites. They had their own tool type called Mousterian Tools. And the Neanderthals had their own technique for making stone tools called the Levallois Technique. So if we look at this Levallois technique, essentially it's where you take a large stone of flint and you start to chip large flakes off of the perimeter, right? And then you begin to kind of hone in on a piece, right? And essentially what they do is once you have that kind of what we call preform, where it's worked down to a nice handy size, you begin to take little blade flakes off of that, right? And those little long channel flakes actually act, those pieces that come off are razor sharp, so you can use them as a cutting implement. So if we look at Mousterian versus Upper Paleolithic tools, basically kind of the competing tool types that we see at the time, Mousterian being produced by Neanderthals and Upper Paleolithic tools being produced by Homo sapiens, right? We have Upper Paleolithic tools generally are more refined in terms of their manufacture, so they have a more refined edge for cutting. Upper Paleolithic times is when we see the introduction of bone tools. And Mousterian tools, in essence, are kind of primarily found in Southern Europe contexts. So the kind of question was, did Neanderthals eat exclusively meat? When we do some of the kind of nitrogen and carbon studies on them, it kind of shows, they have levels that are so high that they're kind of similar to like large predatory cats and large predators. But when we look at the teeth, we notice that enamel hypoplasias are present at an identical frequency to that of modern humans, right? This indicates effective procurement of food from the environment. So enamel hypoplasias, in essence, are these little horizontal lines that form because of you as a child going through nutritional stress. Your teeth that are growing inside your jaw will actually stop depositing enamel, right? And as soon as your nutrition becomes good again, it'll start to deposit enamel again, right? So it forms this little horizontal line on the tooth. And when we look at the kind of frequencies of those horizontal lines, which are called enamel hypoplasias, we notice that in Neanderthals, they're identical to that of humans or Homo sapiens at the time, right? So really, what did Neanderthals eat? Well, when we look at stable isotope testing, we can really become informed on the various parts of their diet. So when we do stable isotope testing on carbon-13 and nitrogen-15, the kind of interesting thing that we see is that Neanderthals are kind of off the chart for kind of nitrogen. They're kind of up in the cluster where we see kind of carnivores are. But we do know, based on kind of studies of their teeth and studies of kind of the fossilized plaque on their teeth, that they did eat vegetation as well. So in essence, your Neanderthals ate meat at similar levels to that of contemporary carnivores, and Neanderthals also ate a lot of plant materials, and they also had a very keen eye for the use of medicinal plants. So dental calculus studies have found kind of the evidence of what we call gelatinized starch grains in Neanderthal teeth, right? This indicates what they were doing was likely cooking some sort of proto-wheat, right, or some sort of plant material that they've found. And they also found high alkaline or bitter plants used for suppressing diet, right? So the Paperno study indicated something pretty important, that Neanderthals, yes, did know about plants as food and knew how to cook them for food as well. And the Karen Hardy study shows that they also had a very keen eye for those medicinal plants, right? They knew which plants to use to suppress diet for when they were going on these kind of long migration journeys or these long hunts. So if we look at one example of a medicinal plant that we found in Neanderthal sites, we have Caroluma fimbriata, right, which we know can be used to suppress thirst and hunger. There are several species that are native to Europe, and the evidence of use goes back as far as 450,000 years ago. So it's something that's been with, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, probably even, perhaps even Homo erectus. That's been with our kind of, genus for a very long time. So in terms of Neanderthals and culture, some of our Neanderthals did not bury their dead, like our wonderful cannibals at Krapina. Most likely they ate them. And some Neanderthals constructed specific burial pits and arranged the corpses, right? We have intentional burials that we have been found at places like La Chapelle-aux Saints, Tabun, as well as Amud, and the Spy site in Belgium. This is what we call a kind of position burial or a flex burial, where the knees are kind of brought up to the chest and the arms are kind of folded across the chest, right? So this is evidence of a very, very intentional, purposeful burial, right? And this comes from the La Chapelle-aux Saints site, right? Actually, we already looked at the skull. If you remember, this is our individual that didn't have any teeth. So if we look at the different kind of burial postures that we see amongst Neanderthals as well as kind of later modern Homo sapiens, we have, of course, flex burials where the individual is placed on their side or back with the knees drawn up to the chest. We have bundle burials where the bones are cleaned and arranged in a bundle, usually wrapped with linen or hide. We also have cremation burials where the remains are cremated and buried in a shallow pit. As well as extended burials, which is kind of what we're most familiar with, is where the individual is just laid out on their back. So if we look at kind of the evidence for ritual burial, we found burials in the Shanidar cave that actually had a series of flowers with different colors arranged sequentially around the burial, right? So what this shows us is that there had to have been some sort of ritual or meaningful activity or meaningful kind of rite that was done when this individual was buried. So a lot of people ask, did Neanderthals kind of have language? Well, that's kind of a heavily debated issue. There's a Lieberman study. Remember, Lieberman's the guy from Harvard that looked at kind of energy efficiency amongst bipeds and quadrupeds, but he also looked at the vocal tracts of Neanderthals versus modern humans, and he determined that the adult Neanderthal vocal tracts were much morphologically similar to newborn infants in modern humans, right? So what he was saying is that Neanderthals were not capable, could not make the range of noises needed for proper speech. But, you know, a lot of people have countered Lieberman and said, well, just because the morphology is a little bit different doesn't necessarily say that the range of, that they couldn't have constructed language out of the range of noises that they were capable of making. So the jury is kind of out. We don't really know if Neanderthals had language or not. So kind of some other evidence that supports that they may have had language is that morphologically they did have a hyoid bone that was identical to modern humans, and we know that the hyoid bone is important in terms of all of the muscle attachment sites for kind of keeping your ability to use speech. And the hyoid bone, like most bones, is highly conserved genetically, right? And is likely present in earlier human ancestors. We just don't generally locate it because the hyoid bone, based on its size and kind of where it's located, it's one of the first bones to kind of deteriorate very quickly. Generally, they don't fossilize. We do know that Neanderthals used symbols or had notions of symbolic thought. At the Cuevas de los Aviones cave site in Spain, we found shells that were that were inscribed with pigment painted on them as well. And we also know that Neanderthals routinely painted eagle talons. So this is showing you the shell. You can kind of see how there is kind of pigment all on the shell on the one side here. And this is just showing you that this was purposefully decorated. This is showing you some of the eagle talons that were found. Generally, what they would do is they would try to drill a hole right into this little foramina here, and they would use that and make a necklace out of it. So they would actually, we found these buried with individuals kind of placed around the neck. So if we look at kind of Neanderthal artistic expression, a lot of what we see is just kind of these renditions of either animals or mythic animals. We think they kind of relate to kind of hunting rituals or something like that. Here's a 40,000-year-old bull painting from a cave in Gibraltar. So if we kind of recap our Neanderthals or what we've kind of discussed so far, they were intelligent tool makers that likely had rudimentary language. Neanderthals interbred with modern humans populations, but perhaps only the females because of that DNA desert. Late archaic Homo sapiens have a mosaic of features that indicate interaction with Homo neanderthalensis. So there were definitely a lot of hybridization events occurring, at least in the Middle East and some parts of Eastern Europe. So one kind of interesting piece of evidence that we don't really have a good explanation for, you may be asking, if we can trace all of the mtDNA for all modern humans back to Africa, well, why don't we just do the same thing for Neanderthals? Well, it's interesting because Neanderthals have similar mtDNA lineages with each other, yet they are extremely dissimilar with that of modern humans, right? Just another piece of evidence saying that they evolved out of a completely separate lineage, right? We know that mtDNA is passed from mother to offspring, and there are many lineages that are notably absent in Neanderthals that are present in modern Homo sapiens, right? So this is really showing that, this is just another piece of evidence that shows that Neanderthals may have evolved independently in Europe and kind of have been just, an odd special cousin to Homo sapiens. So if we look at kind of genes and Africa itself, right, we already talked about this a little bit where we said that Africa had the greatest genetic diversity, right? But it also has the kind of greatest diversity of genetic material as well as the anatomical phenotypic variation, right? And there are two potential explanations for this. A long-lasting population will accumulate more mutations in their genome, right? So as humans evolved in Africa and lived there the longest, of course, that's why we would have that much genetic diversity. Or Africa had a larger breeding population than what we see being founded in other parts of the world. So when we look at, where the Neanderthals could possibly have gone, right, what's the explanation behind the Neanderthal extinction? There are three kind of competing theories or actually they're theories, they have evidence behind them. We have the climate change, which caused Neanderthals to become unsuitable to most environments, particularly within their home range in Europe. We have modern humans just simply out-competing Neanderthals in the mating game. We were able to breed faster than they were. And a newer theory suggests that Neanderthal men were sterile, right, that DNA desert. Most likely it's a combination of all of these, right? That DNA desert does play a significant role, whereas also climate change, right, as they're becoming unsuited for the climates in Europe, they're kind of starting to travel to look for better places to live, and this is where they're coming into contact with these modern human groups, right? And that's where they begin to breed, right? And modern humans just were able to breed more effectively, breed in larger numbers, and spread out a little bit faster. So where do we go from here, right? So by 25,000 years ago, Homo sapiens dominate the globe and begin to colonize and populate a diversity of geographic and climatic areas. By 22,000 years ago, all Homo sapiens have the same generalized skeletal anatomy. During this period, we start to see an explosion or an exponential explosion of things like culture, technology, art, and of course later society.